Our discussion today is going to center around what I refer to, and actually I stole the term, a tale of two councils. It'll deal with the councils of war held by Joe Hooker at Chancellorsville and 2 months later by George Meade at Gettysburg. We have to do a little bit of background information on this just to get started. I apologize in advance. I may go just a little bit longer than Dale did last week. Hopefully nobody will fall asleep on me, and hopefully we won't have any technical difficulties. And of course, I'll be around for a little bit if anybody has any questions once we're done, if we don't have enough time for those. Our tale begins in late December 1863. In the Federal Army of the Potomac, the sword of Lincoln, as author Jeffrey Wirt has styled it, is at its lowest ebb since the war began nearly 20 months before. Its lopsided thrashing at the hands of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia less than 2 weeks before has sent a current of demoralization running through the Army. The downward spiral began over 6 weeks before when President Abraham Lincoln sent their revered General George McClellan into forced retirement. Lincoln's legendary patience with McClellan had finally run its course, and with it, so had the career of George McClellan. On November 7, 1862, War Department staffer Brigadier General Catharinus Buckingham navigated the early winter snow squalls through guerrilla-infested northern Virginia to deliver General Orders 182 to Army of Potomac headquarters. Lincoln will now turn to Ambrose Burnside. Twice before, the president had asked Burnside to take command of the Army, and twice before, Burnside had declined because he believed he wasn't capable of leading such a large body of men. He'll accept the command this time and now proceed to prove it. In his largely self-fulfilling prophecy, will cost the lives of about 13,000 of his men on the slopes of Marye's Heights and the fields in Fredericksburg. Ambrose Everett Burnside was born in 1824. He was the son of a South Carolina planter who relocated to the Hoosier state of Indiana. Burnside would matriculate at West Point at the age of 19 and graduate 4 years later with a respectable 18th place standing in the class of 1847. He was just 3 spots behind future Confederate A.P. Hill, and 1 year behind his very good friend, George Brinton McClellan. Burnside is described almost universally as a dapper, genial, a friendly man. He seems to have gotten along with just about everyone. However, it appears the stars from the very beginning have been aligned against Burnside. He would leave the old Army in 1853 to manufacture a breech-loading carbine. It was his own design. He dreamed of making a fortune of selling them to the Army of the United States. His business acumen, however, presaged his military abilities. He was forced to sell his factory and his patents to avoid bankruptcy, and it would be others who would manufacture some 55,000 Burnside carbines and sell them to the government. And it was a first-class weapon, probably second only to the Sharps and the Spencers, although I'm sure next week Brother Tom Tate will tell us that they really weren't that good anyway, that the muzzle loaders without the rifling would be just fine. Even in love, the fates would be cruel to Ambrose Burnside, who would literally be jilted at the altar by a Kentucky belle. Burnside did have a solid, if not overly spectacular, career before coming to command the Army. His day at Antietam lacked brilliance, however, and he took hours to get across a narrow stone bridge that would ever after bear his name. His entire 9th Corps held at bay by about 400 Georgia sharpshooters. The delay would be costly because it would give Lee just enough time to get the absolute last of his troops into the Battle of Antietam. The double-quicking Light Division, led by Burnside's old classmate, Ambrose Powell Hill, who literally, along with his troops, had all but jogged 17 miles from Harper's Ferry. They would stop Burnside's delinquent attack, and they would save the Army of Northern Virginia. Now, it is axiomatic that if you don't have faith in your own abilities, it's unlikely others will either. Confederate staff officer Moxley Sorrell would charitably opine long after the war was over that Burnside could and would fight, even if he did not know how. Fellow General Joseph Hooker, one of few people Burnside actively disliked, was more blunt when he proclaimed, and I quote, "Burnside has a brain the size of a hickory nut," end quote. Small wonder that Ambrose felt the way he did about fighting Joe. But Burnside did come up with a plan that was sound and which could have succeeded if things would have gone even a little bit in his favor. But his designs began to unravel almost from the start, and Burnside cannot, in the modern military parlance, overcome, adapt, or improvise. He resignedly proceeds to develop a straight-ahead attack against the Army of Northern Virginia that has had weeks to entrench itself on commanding high ground just to the west of Fredericksburg. Now, most people who think of Fredericksburg recall the repeated and nearly suicidal assaults by the Union Army against the Southerners on Marye's Heights. Cannon protected by lunettes poured murderous fire, grape shot, spherical case, canister against the advancing troops. Huge holes were blown into the lines. Soldiers were struck down and literally blown to pieces from the time they came into view and all during their ascent of the heights. As they came into range, volleys of aimed musketry from rebels deployed in a sunken road and protected by a stone wall shattered regiment upon regiment, brigade upon brigade, and division upon division. Now, a close second in recalling Fredericksburg is the damage inflicted upon the old colonial capital. Federal artillery from the north bank of the Rappahannock had blown gaping holes into house and home throughout the town of 2000 in an effort to drive off several Mississippi sharpshooters who peppered Union soldiers and pontoneers as they were trying to bridge the river to get into Fredericksburg, including some of those that Dale discussed with us last week from the 50th New York Engineers. Once they had gotten across the river and accomplished that, however, the Confederate guns rained shot and shell on the town against the Yankee occupiers. Once they were in Fredericksburg, the Federal troops simply turned into riotous vandals, sacking Fredericksburg with a bloodlust that would have made Attila the Hun proud. The once charming and prosperous town was laid waste, and when residents began to return after the battle, they found little to which they could return to. Less remembered, though, is that Lee's line of battle was nearly 7 miles long, running from the Rappahannock River just to the north of Marye's Heights, south over Willis Hill, Telegraph Hill, soon to become Lee's Hill, and all the way down the ridge line to Prospect Hill, the Massaponax Creek, and to Hamilton's Crossing. It was at the lower end of the line, in front of Stonewall Jackson's troops, where Union troops, Pennsylvanians under George Gordon Meade, actually broke through the Confederate lines and began to roll up rebels to the north and the south. But again, yet again, fate conspires against success for Ambrose Burnside. The failure of subordinates to support Meade's attack gave the Southerners the time they needed to redeploy, counterattack, and drive Meade's winded troops back to their starting point. This is in the area that will come to be known as the Slaughter Pen. At the end of the day, all that Burnside has to show for his effort is a casualty list containing over 13,000 names. Lee has suffered only 5,000, and most of those are from Jackson's fight. Never has there been, nor will there be, such a lopsided victory. Burnside hasn't quite gotten it yet. He decides to personally head another charge up Marye's Heights the next day at the head of his old 9th Corps, but some of his staff officers, with a bit more discretion than valor, managed to talk him down. The Battle of Fredericksburg is, for all intents and purposes, over. Thus will begin what author Stephen Sears calls the Revolt of the Generals. This will be in his classic study on the Battle of Chancellorsville. Burnside will continue to keep his own counsel, choosing not to discuss things with his subordinate generals. He feels they haven't been supportive of them, as indeed they have not. But this is the Army. Everybody knows, if you've been in the military, everybody knows when something is going on, and they know that something's going on now. If for no other reason, the Army's not moved into winter quarters. It's deep in December. Indeed, the Christmas holidays are upon us, and it's time to do something. Left Grand Division Commander William Franklin and his immediate subordinate, 6th Corps leader William Baldy Smith, begin to fret, especially when they receive orders on December 29th to have their men prepare 3 days' rations and have 60 rounds of ammunition issued to them. With a nudge and a wink, they give leave to two of their subordinates, General John Newton and Brigade Commander John Cochran. They're given leave to travel to Washington, D.C. to talk to someone, anyone. Really doesn't matter who, just someone who will listen, who can understand the frustration of the Army, and who can do something to stop whatever is about to happen from becoming yet another Burnside boondoggle. Now, Cochran is a political general. He served in Congress. He knows his way around the Capitol very well. He first sets his sights on Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts, the powerful chairman of the Military Affairs Committee. But it's the holidays. Senator Wilson has gone home. Cochran then turns to Congressman Moses Odell of New York, one of the members of the Jacobin Committee on the Conduct of the War. But, like most congressmen, Odell has also gone home. So, Cochran will stop and visit an old friend, Secretary of State William Seward, and Seward agrees to get them in to see President Lincoln. Collecting John Newton back at the hotel, Cochran tells him they're going to see the president. Now, this is not what John Newton had signed on for. He's a professional Army man. He's been in the Army for years. He understands the chain of command. A conversation with a friendly politician is one thing, but jumping several levels on the org chart to the commander-in-chief is something quite different. But Cochran, with Newton in tow, was received by the president late in the afternoon of December 30th. Now, Lincoln is not particularly happy with this visit. He's not particularly happy to see two relatively junior officers complaining to him about their boss. But the ever-patient president does listen to what they have to say. Newton will take time to point out that there's no effort to undermine Burnside, but he feels it's his duty as a soldier to let someone know the lack of faith the officers and men in the Army have in their commander in the wake of Fredericksburg. And it's been less than 2 weeks since that fiasco. And they're especially concerned about the lack of confidence at the start of another campaign. Now, the president sits up and takes notice. This is something new. He's not aware of the Army taking the field again. And he's not at all that comfortable about finding something out from these two gentlemen that he didn't find out from his commander. He thanks both, and he assures them he's not going to sell them out, as indeed he will not. Now Lincoln will make one of his innumerable trips to the War Department telegraph office, and at 3:30 in the afternoon, a wire will go to Burnside telling him, "I have good reason for saying you must not make a general movement of the Army without letting me know." Meanwhile, back in Fredericksburg, Burnside is stunned. He's kept his plans to himself. He's not even discussed them with his Grand Division commanders. How could Lincoln have known? To make matters worse, now he's an Army commander with no Army to command. He can't do anything. He immediately replies to the president, asking for permission to come up to the Capitol for a chat, and New Year's Eve will find him at the White House. Now, Burnside's plan did have some merit. It was certainly much more imaginative than his December 13th assault up against Marye's Heights. He's apparently absorbed the idea that frontal assaults uphill against entrenched artillery and infantry is not a good idea, so he's working on an end around. This downstream plan that Lincoln has squelched, though, maybe it's not the best way to go. So he's going to come back to the office. He can't do what he was going to do. He's going to come up with Plan B. January 1863 is unseasonably warm in Virginia. There's been no significant rain or snow. The roads are still firm and able to support an army on the move. Burnside now wants to move up the north bank of the Rappahannock to one of the fords west of Fredericksburg and come in on Lee's flank or rear. January 20th sees the Army of the Potomac on the move. Burnside keeps his plans close to his vest, but he does tell his commanders to have his men prepare 3 days' ration, carry them in their haversack, and put another 10 days in the wagons. Specific marching orders will be given as the campaign begins to unfold. The first day proceeds without a hitch. Everything's going just splendidly. And even the men seem to undergo a slight uplifting of their spirits. But once again, the fates are going to be cruel to Ambrose Burnside. It begins to drizzle. Then the rain gets harder. Temperature drops. Now we're going to add some sleet to the mixture. Those firm Virginia roads of a couple of hours ago, they start to become veritable quicksand. Tens of thousands of marching feet and wagon and cannon wheels stir this witch's brew into something in which men sink up to their knees or even as far as their hips. Double and triple teams of horses cannot budge the artillery, even with as many as 150 soldiers helping out by pulling on ropes. Horses and mules quite literally sink out of sight, never to be seen again. And so this campaign will go into history as the Mud March. Adding to the misery, rebels on the other side of the river are jeering and taunting the bogged down Army of the Potomac. They're painting signs saying Burnside, stuck in the mud, this way to Richmond. Officers and men now are openly criticizing Burnside, who has no other choice than to tell his army to make its way back as best it can to his camps in Falmouth. Author David McCullough will one day suggest this was the Union's Valley Forge. By the 24th, the campaign is over, and the Army now will go into winter quarters. Burnside is frustrated and depressed. He now vents his spleen on the discordant members of his Greek chorus. He drafts General Orders Number 8. Left Division Commander William Franklin is out of here. Center Grand Division Commander Joe Hooker is not even out of here. He's completely gone from the Army. By now, he's going to send William Baldy Smith along. He's also figured out that John Cochrane and John Newton were the guys who had gone up to Washington to see the president. For good measure, he adds General William Brooks, a 6th Corps Division Commander. And also, just for the heck of it, he throws in one of Franklin's staff officers, Colonel J.H. Taylor. But one of Burnside's staffers, in a moment of clarity, points out to him that, boss, it's actually Lincoln who appoints who is and who is not a Corps commander. Maybe it would be a good idea if you ran General Orders Number 8 past him first. Burnside sees the wisdom in this, and on January 24th, he again travels to Washington. He essentially gives Lincoln an ultimatum: endorse General Orders Number 8 or accept my resignation. Now, as we all know, Lincoln has been a lawyer riding circuit and a politician for a couple of decades, and he isn't one who tends to get intimidated by anybody's ultimatum. He tells Burnside he wants to talk things over with some of his people. He'll meet with them again the next morning. When Burnside comes back to see the president on the morning of January 25th, he finds he is no longer the commander of the Army of the Potomac. But Lincoln does like Burnside. He believes he has his uses, much to his regret, he'll find. He tells him his resignation will not be accepted, and instead he's going to give him 30 days leave and find him a new assignment. And thus will end the first act of our tragedy as protagonist Ambrose Burnside, a decent, likable, and a flawed man, is sent into exile in the backwater department of Ohio, where he'll eventually cause Lincoln still more headaches as he shuts down newspapers, throws dissident Democrats into jail, including one rather loud and vociferous Congressman, Clement Vallandigham. Now, as I mentioned, Ambrose Burnside did not actively dislike many people, but his former Center Grand Division Commander Joe Hooker was definitely on the short list. He had played the role of antagonist and was not shy about telling almost anyone who would listen that he was a far better general than Burnside. And for that matter, just about anybody else. Following the federal debacle after First Bull Run in 1861, Hooker unashamedly and unabashedly told Abraham Lincoln himself, "It is no vanity to me to say that I am a damned sight better general than any you had on that field." So, on January 26th, boasting or not, Hooker will be recast in our production from the role of antagonist to protagonist, and coincidentally, the newest commanding general of the Army of the Potomac, if you keep track of them as they go by. Now, since the Peninsula Campaign, let's back that up there a second. Since the Peninsula Campaign the previous spring, Hooker's been known by the moniker Fighting Joe. He doesn't really care for the name. In fact, it was really the result of some bad editing in a newspaper. We do that stuff these days, yet only it's done electronically. And what should have been Fighting, Joe Hooker turns into forevermore Fighting Joe Hooker. Hooker's 48 years old at the time of his appointment. An 1837 graduate of West Point, he was number 29 in a class of 50. He saw service in the Second Seminole War, and he was in Mexico where he was brevetted 3 times for gallantry. Unfortunately for him, I know this will be a major surprise, his mouth had gotten him into trouble with General Winfield Scott, and that would slightly delay the start of his Civil War career, at least until Scott was sent off and being retired. Hooker had resigned from the old Army in 1853, took up the life of a farmer and state militiaman out in California. But the title of Fighting Joe is not altogether inappropriate. Hooker is many things, not necessarily all of them good. In fact, New England blue blood Captain Charles Francis Adams, the grandson and great-grandson of presidents, would sniff indignantly that Hooker's headquarters was a place to which no self-respecting man liked to go and no decent woman could go. It was a combination of a barroom and brothel. But as a brigade, division, and corps commander, Hooker had always led from the front. In fact, he'd been wounded at Antietam some 4 months before in the maelstrom of the cornfield. He'd always been aggressive, and that has been an oasis of relief to Lincoln and the radical Republicans who have been vexed to near apoplexy by generals who always call for more men and supplies, but are never quite ready to fight a battle. Lincoln knows all about Hooker, though. In giving him the Army command, Lincoln has written him a personal come-to-Jesus letter. He will tell him, "I've placed you at the head of the Army of the Potomac. Of course, I have done this on what appears to be sufficient reasons. And yet I think it best for you to know that there are some things in regard to which I am not quite satisfied with you. I believe you to be a brave and skillful soldier, which of course I like. I also believe you do not mix politics with your profession, in which you are right." The boss was a little off on that one. "You have confidence in yourself," no kidding, "which is valuable, if not an indispensable quality. You are ambitious, which within reasonable bounds does good rather than harm. But I think during General Burnside's command of the Army, you have taken counsel of your ambition and thwarted him as much as you could, in which you did a great wrong to the country and to a most meritorious and honorable brother officer." Now we're going to set the hook. "I have heard, in such a way as to believe it, of your recently saying that both the Army and the government needed a dictator. Of course, it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain success can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship." He goes on to tell him that the government will support him as they always have, and in the end he will tell him once again that He needs to go forward and give us victories. Now, there's no question that Lincoln has lectured the pompous Fighting Joe, as we would say here in Berks County, like a Dutch uncle. And it might be expected that Hooker would be none too pleased. Somewhat surprisingly, though, he boasts about the letter. He shows it to friends and claims it's just the sort of letter a father would write to a son. He'll keep it as one of his most prized possessions. He'll arrange for it to be included in Samuel Bates's 1882 work on the Battle of Chancellorsville, and a bit later on in the official records themselves. Now, with Lincoln's admonishment ringing in his ears, Hooker sets to work to right the wrongs afflicting the Army of the Potomac. Thus far, more than a quarter of the Army has been absent without leave. Following Fredericksburg, the desertion rate had absolutely soared. Not just individuals, but whole squads and whole companies were going on, as they call it, French leave. In fact, had the more than 25,000 absent men been present, they would have formed a unit larger than every corps in the Army of the Potomac, save the 6th Corps. Hooker will reduce that rate to just under 5% by ensuring that his troops are fed. Men will get rations that they haven't gotten previously, but have been nearby in bulging warehouses, but somebody just couldn't seem to get them to the guys who needed them. An army subsists on its stomach, and the fresh beef, vegetables, and fruits begin to satisfy the basic need. Fresh bread is made available 4 times a week. More importantly, Hooker sees that the Army paymasters finally show up and visit the troops and get them paid. That hasn't happened for several months. When a private makes only $13 a month, the lack of paychecks is going to affect him. It's also going to affect the folks back home. Now, with full bellies and some money in their pocket, Hooker will put them to work cleaning up the camps, the filth and squalor of the winter camps that were not scientifically laid out. This will begin to tell in the reduction of disease and the number of men on the sick rolls. Drill will be reinstituted, and troops will begin to regain some of the esprit de corps they had developed under their hero, George McClellan. A system of furloughs will be implemented using a carrot and stick approach. Units that meet the tough standards of Hooker's inspectors will get time off. Those that don't will stay in camp until they get their act together. Hooker also introduces a new twist, the introduction of corps badges. Special badges to identify each corps and each division within a corps. This was initially intended as a management tool to allow generals to identify troops that performed particularly well or those who didn't. The badges, however, have the added effect of instilling unit pride. The corps badge will be red for the 1st Division, white for the 2nd, and blue for the 3rd. So everyone will immediately know a soldier wearing a white star is a member of the 2nd Division of the 12th Corps. A red Maltese cross identifies a soldier in the 1st Division of the 5th Corps, and so on. Now it seems that Fighting Joe might be better described as Administrative Joe, so says Stephen Sears. But Hooker's focus is not just on his men, he also reorganizes the Army. The grand divisions of Ambrose Burnside are gone, and Sumner, Franklin, and Franz Sigel are out of the picture. Corps commanders now will report directly to Hooker. John Reynolds will retain command of the 1st Corps. Darius Couch becomes his senior corps commander, and he'll second in command of the Army. George Stoneman will be relieved of command of the 3rd Corps, and he'll be given the cavalry. In his place, we find the notorious Daniel Edgar Sickles. He's now received his 2nd star. Not bad for a former Tammany Hall politician and former congressman who's probably best known for having shot his wife's lover literally within shouting distance of the White House, and who will be the first killer to be found not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. After which he will scandalize Washington society by reconciling with his unfaithful wife. George Meade has been the only major general in the Army who commanded a brigade, while several others junior to him, including some brigadiers, had been leading corps. Hooker sets this right by assigning him the 5th Corps. In so doing, he displaces Daniel Butterfield, who, despite his enduring friendship with Hooker and being given the sinecure of Chief of Staff, will harbor an everlasting grudge against George Meade for the rest of his days. Baldy Smith has been exiled from the Army, and Uncle John Sedgwick will take over the 6th Corps. The 9th Corps, Burnside's old command, was never quite at home with the Army of the Potomac. If you read the history of the 9th Corps, it's in and out, it goes all over the place, it stops by every once in a while. It's sort of like a lost relative. But it's going to leave, it's going with Burnside out to Ohio when he assumes his new duties. Franz Sigel's old command, the 11th Corps, is probably the most unhappy lot, and that's from its commanding general down to the lowliest private. Many in the Corps are from the growing German expatriate community. It was Sigel who recruited them, and it was they who proudly proclaimed, "I fights mit Sigel." They're not happy that their hero has been replaced by the pious abolitionist Oliver Otis Howard. And Howard returns the feeling because he doesn't think an awful lot of his men. These chickens will come home to roost, no pun intended, not once but twice, at the hands of Stonewall Jackson's hard-fighting veterans. And finally, the 12th Corps will remain in the capable hands of Henry Warner Slocum. These men missed the Fredericksburg disaster while they were garrisoning Harper's Ferry, and they are both fresh and unjaded. Reorganization complete, and his Army gaming martial spirit, Hooker sets to work on plans to meet Robert Edward Lee. Now, while he never admits or gives credits to his predecessor, Hooker actually expands on Burnside's plan that resulted in the ill-fated Mud March. He designs a strategy of holding Lee in place at Fredericksburg with part of his army, while another part marches up the North Bank and descends, crosses the Rappahannock, and crosses the fords, and descends on Lee's rear. In Hooker's own words, and I know you'll find this a surprise, "My plans are perfect. May God have mercy on General Lee, for I shall have none." And so it would seem. On April 27th, the 5th, 11th, and 12th Corps begin their march up the north bank of the Rappahannock and beyond its confluence with the Rapidan. Stoneman's Cavalry Corps has long since departed on a far-ranging expedition to get behind Lee's army, cut his communications, and do everything they can to annoy Lee and the Army of the Northern Virginia. The infantry will cross at Kelly's Ford on the 28th, then turn south to cross Germanna and Ely's Ford on the Rapidan the following day. Elements of the 2nd Corps will join them after crossing at United States Ford, just below the confluence of the two rivers. By the afternoon of April 30th, half of Hooker's host is clustering in the wilderness near the Chancellorsville mansion. And even the dour and reserved George Meade is heard to exclaim, "Hurrah for old Joe! We're on Lee's flank, and he does not know it. You take the plank road toward Fredericksburg, and I'll take the pike, or vice versa, and you prefer, and we'll get out of this wilderness." Now, the wilderness encompasses some 70 square miles south of the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers. The mature growth trees have been cut over several times and feed little iron furnaces in the region. And the area is largely dominated by an ugly and impenetrable scrub, brush, and small trees such as blackjack and hickory. There are few clearings, fewer farms and homes, and only a couple of roads suitable for Army operations. The Orange Turnpike and Orange Plank Road run east-west through the wilderness. North-south thoroughfares worthy of the name are few and far between. By the evening of the 30th, Hooker himself has arrived at Chancellorsville. Now, it's less than a ville than it is a home, formerly serving as an inn along the Orange Turnpike. The Chancellor home will become the nerve center of the Union Army for the next few days, as the family will be exiled to the 2nd floor when Hooker and his staff appropriate the 1st floor as their headquarters. It is from here that Hooker will dictate General Orders 47 to his army, in which he says, It is with heartfelt satisfaction the commanding general announces the Army that the operations of the last 3 days have determined that our enemy must either ingloriously fly or come out from behind his defenses and give us battle on our own ground where certain destruction awaits him. Fighting Joe is overheard commenting, by a reporter nonetheless, "The rebel army is now the legitimate property of the Army of the Potomac." Unfortunately, as we shall see, Hooker has failed to get Robert E. Lee to acquiesce in those particular sentiments. Now, Lee is in a tough spot. While facing the Army of the Potomac at Fredericksburg over the past 4 months, he'd sent James Longstreet and a large portion of his First Corps off to Southside Virginia. The intent was to deal with some federal activity in the Suffolk area, but more importantly, to scour the country for badly needed supplies. This reduces his effective manpower to about 60,000. Now, that's enough to watch the Army of the Potomac from within the entrenched defenses, but it could prove to be a bit short for maneuvering and engaging in battle. Lee had not yet recalled Longstreet as April began to fade into May, so he found himself not entirely prepared to deal with Hooker's movements. Conventional wisdom of the time would have suggested that retreat was in order, as Hooker was crowing some 10 miles to the west. Unfortunately for him, Robert E. Lee was anything but a conventional soldier. Upon learning of the upriver crossings on April 29th, Lee sent the remainder of Longstreet's troops, still with the Army, west out the Orange Turnpike to see what Hooker was doing and to keep them from doing it. Meanwhile, Lee looked to the east at the activity across the Rappahannock for another day before concluding that those troops were nothing more than an aggressive feint and the real danger lay to the west. With that, he leaves about 9,000 of his men in their Fredericksburg defenses and heads west with the majority of Stonewall Jackson's Second Corps on May 1st. A collision is inevitable because Hooker has already dispatched Meade's 5th Corps and Slocum's 12th Corps east. Howard's 11th Corps is in close support, and the newly arrived 3rd Corps is in reserve. All told, Hooker has 70,000 men and 184 pieces of artillery, far more than Lee and Jackson can counter. The troops break clear of the wilderness. They deploy in line of battle, advancing steadily against the paltry force of Confederates arrayed along Zoan Church Ridge about 3 miles east of Chancellorsville. The battle, though, is not yet fully developed or 3 hours old when the cocky Fighting Joe suddenly undergoes a critical change in attitude. He orders the advance to be suspended and the troops to withdraw back to Chancellorsville. Slocum is apoplectic. He'll later claim he'd not yet lost a dozen men when he was ordered to retreat. Meade, as befitting his legendary temper, exclaims, "My God, if we can't hold the top of a hill, we certainly can't hold the bottom of it." But back they go to begin entrenching around Chancellorsville. Hooker maintains an outward bravado, claiming that Lee was just where I want him. He must fight me on my own ground. But everyone realizes the magnitude of the lost opportunity. The decision to fight a defensive battle and rendering the manpower and artillery advantages moot by the choking confines of the infernal wilderness. And there ends the action for May Day, 1863. Hooker is withdrawn into a defensive posture, and Lee and Jackson are anxiously seeking ways to get at him. That night, they'll sit by a low bivouac fire on some abandoned Federal cracker boxes, talking things over. They'll learn from Cavalry Chief Jeb Stuart that an opportunity exists to the west, where it appears Hooker's troops are not entrenched. They come up with a plan that has become legendary in the annals of military history: Jackson's flank attack at Chancellorsville, the harbinger of Lee's greatest victory. It will take most of the day for Jackson to move his 28,000 men south and then west to make a sufficiently wide circuit to pull off this plan. In the meantime, Lee's going to have to revert to being a corps commander and handle the 13,000 troops he has left to keep Hooker's attention focused on him. At one point along the march, the Confederates were visible to Union troops who set off and engaged him in what was thought to be a rearguard action by a retreating army. On the west end of the Union line was the unhappy 11th Corps. Army commanders did not think much of the Dutchmen that predominated this corps, an opinion shared by Commander Oliver Howard. Hooker had earlier warned Howard to keep an eye out to the west by advancing his pickets, and Howard had received other intelligence suggesting something was afoot. But with the Union battle line facing in a generally northeast to southwest direction, Howard's troops are really the rear of the army, acting as a reserve. Nothing significant was done to prepare for the Jacksonian hurricane about to descend on the unfortunate 11th Corps. Sometime between 5:15 and 6 p.m., Federal soldiers were relaxing in camp when preparing their evening meals with their arms stacked, when they started to see a bevy of wildlife darting out of the nearby tree line. Rabbits, deer, and wild birds scattered through the lines to the wonder and amusement of the Yankees before a more dangerous prey interrupted the revelry. 20,000 charging Confederates whooping the dreaded rebel yell at the top of their lungs. Jackson's attack would roll forward over everything it came across for nearly 2 miles and for 2 hours until stiffening resistance, unit disorganization, and nightfall would finally bring their charge to a halt. Now, as we all know, the ever-aggressive Jackson had ideas of a night attack. He had his foe demoralized and on the run. He did not want to give him time to recover. He needed to reach both the United States ford to cut off a retreat and reestablish connection with Robert E. Lee's portion of the Army to make victory complete and total. Along with perhaps 10 staff members and couriers, Jackson ventured beyond his own picket line for several hundred yards before coming to the conclusion he could not continue the attack and that perhaps he had gone too far. Historian and author Robert K. Crick would call it the smoothbore volley that doomed the Confederacy. The moon shone eerily through the trees and smoke of the wilderness that evening. There was considerable interaction between Federal and Confederate troops. At one point, a single shot turns into a volley south of the Orange Turnpike. It travels up the line to the north, finally working its way to the 18th North Carolina. They would fire in their front. In the process, they would kill a good number of Jackson's party, and the general himself would be struck 3 times on the left arm and unhorsed by friendly fire. He would be painfully extricated from his precarious position, taken to a field hospital, and have his arm amputated at the shoulder in the wee hours of Sunday, May 3rd. Jackson's recovery would be complicated by the onset of pneumonia. He would die 1 week later when he would pass over the river and rest under the shade of the trees. When the sun rises on the morning of May 3rd, Jeb Stuart will be taking the reins of the 2nd Corps due to casualties and inexperience in its high command. And he will set to work with a will, trying to follow up on Jackson's plan to reach the United States ford and connect his men with those of Lee. He will seize an open area called Hazel Grove, which is slightly higher than the Chancellorsville Mansion and the crossroads about a mile to the northeast. One of the Confederacy's most able artillerists, E. Porter Alexander, will squeeze 30 guns into this relatively small space, and they will make Chancellorsville completely untenable for the Federals. More significantly, Alexander learns from Federal prisoners that the Chancellor House is Hooker's headquarters, so he takes it deliberately under fire, striking one of its front porch columns and splitting it lengthwise. Unfortunately for Joe Hooker, he was leaning on that pillar at that very moment. The column crashes against Hooker from head to toe and throws him onto the porch floor, completely senseless. It was immediately feared he had been killed. Even after it was determined he was still breathing, Army Medical Director Dr. Jonathan Letterman doubts he'll survive. Today, we recognize all the signs and symptoms of a severe concussion: difficulty remaining conscious, an inability to think, wooziness, vomiting, and the like. In such circumstances, an incapacitated commander is duty-bound to turn command over to his second. Unfortunately, no one had the presence of mind to send for 2nd Corps Commander Darius Couch, the second in command of the Army. By the time he was notified and reports to headquarters, Hooker started to revive a bit. He's trying to mount his horse. So, Couch rides back to his men. Minutes later, Hooker collapses again, falls off his horse. Hence the rumors that he was drunk. It would be another half hour before Couch returned to his side. The Army of the Potomac was leaderless for an hour, but it just so happened to be the most critical hour of the battle. Now, while Hooker was struggling to regain some control of himself and, by extension, his army, the Confederates had been turning up the pressure. They pushed Union troops into a tight semicircle, but they'd been unable to make any additional progress against it despite suffering heavy casualties. What they had done, however, was push the Federals sufficiently far back to allow the two Confederate wings to reunite. If May 3rd ended poorly for the Army of the Potomac and its high command, most especially Hooker, May 4th would become a day of confusion, frustration, and fear. All signs of an army that had no game plan or a commander who was able to overcome, adapt, and improvise to retrieve its fortunes. Much of the day would involve action well to the east, the often overlooked battles at Chancellorsville, in which the 6th Corps would finally assault and carry Marye's Heights, and then head west into battle with Lee's veterans at Salem Church, before becoming nearly surrounded and trapped themselves against the Rappahannock River. Hooker's troops sat idle in their works north of Chancellorsville, imagining great hordes of rebels in front of every command, and even on the north bank of the river cutting into their lifelines. And the false rumor that James Longstreet's troops would soon be on the field did nothing to allay their tensions. Now, since the start of the campaign, Hooker had followed his grand strategy. He crossed the Rappahannock and Rapidan unopposed. He turned Lee's forces out of their Fredericksburg position and forced the Confederates into an open field engagement. However, that cocksure attitude had given way to doubt, and Lee has clearly outgeneraled him. Everything was starting to go downhill, and it appeared the time had come to fold. For the first and only time in the Chancellorsville campaign, Hooker opts to call on his corps commanders to share in the decision-making, and thus begins the first of our tale of two councils. Perhaps the most even-handed description of the high-level conference that took place in Hooker's command tent outside the Bullock House, a mile or so north of the smoldering ruins of the Chancellor Mansion, come from the Chief Engineer of the Army, Brigadier General Gouverneur Kemble Warren. He would write several weeks later in response to an inquiry from General Meade that General Hooker stated the condition of affairs and expressed some apprehension of want of steadiness on some of our troops, as exhibited by uncalled firing along some parts of the line, and as I understood, presented to their consideration on this account the question of advancing or retiring. Hooker emphasized the negatives with respect to continuing the fight. Less forthcoming was the information that he had available to him that would have been positive. He was clearly leaning toward a retreat when Meade brought him up short by asking if this was, in fact, a council of war. If so, it's protocol for the commanding general to excuse himself so subordinate commanders can speak freely amongst themselves. This had not been Hooker's original design, but he was still showing his customary lack of firmness, and both he and Chief of Staff Butterfield withdrew. Warren continues, I heard Generals Meade, Reynolds, and Howard speak in favor of advancing. General Couch did not at first feel competent to give an opinion, as he had not all the facts in his knowledge. General Sickles then said his profession was not that of a soldier, and perhaps his opinion was entitled to but little consideration. Didn't stop him from giving it, however. He did not think the effect in the country of our withdrawal would be fatal, that a victory over the enemy was doubtful, and a defeat would endanger Washington. The uncertainties were against us. For his part, he would confess that he was astonished in the manner in which the commanding general had presented the subject. He expected the responsibilities would not be thrown on them. At that point, Warren claimed he fell out of place and chose to leave the conference because of his confidential relations to the commanding general. Warren's summary is both fair and balanced, based on the evidence. Reynolds' Corps had not seen very much action, and he felt an attack was a good idea. Then, recognizing the sometimes questionable value of staff meetings, he gave Meade his proxy, went off in the corner, and fell asleep. In a council of war, the junior commander is the one who votes first. Oliver Otis Howard was the junior commander, so he will be the guy who votes first. He knows the rout of the 11th Corps in the face of Jackson's attack 2 days before had much to do with the current predicament, perhaps partly to save face and perhaps partly so his men would have an opportunity to redeem themselves. Howard votes to attack. Dan Sickles owes his position to his friend Hooker. He doesn't want to cross him. He'll recount the old requirement of protecting Washington, and retreat will not necessarily be fatal to the cause. Admitting he's not a military command, he says the commanding general should know best, so he's going to back him. Next comes George Meade. Competent, quiet, he has a renowned temper. His blood's up. He's already shown he's willing to go nose to nose with Hooker. His 5th Corps started the fight east of Chancellorsville and out of the wilderness 4 days previously. But then he was called off. Since then, he's been in reserve, hasn't even seen a rebel. He's tired of the old excuse about Washington, and he wants to get into the fight. With Reynolds' proxy in his pocket, the vote will now become 3-1 in favor of going on the offense. With John Sedgwick miles downstream facing Lee's troops on his own, and Henry Slocum now wandering the wilderness in search of headquarters after the courier sent to find him to tell him about the meeting managed to get lost as well, that leaves only 2nd Corps Commander Darius Couch, the Army's second in command, to cast his vote. Warren has written that Couch did not feel competent to give an opinion, although 20 years later, Couch himself would write he wanted to attack as long as he could make the decision on where to attack, and, by the way, as long as Joe Hooker is not in command. But at the time, no one recalled him saying any such thing, and Couch would vote to retreat. The final tally is 3-2 in favor of going on the offense. Now then, Hooker and Butterfield rejoin the Corps commanders. They hear their decisions. And with that, Hooker announced the Army will begin its withdrawal. He sends similar instructions downstream to Banks Ford for Sedgwick's 6th Corps. The final act in the Battle of Chancellorsville is about to begin, and all that was left would be the accusations and the recriminations. At the end of the first of our 2 councils of war, Hooker is elected to ignore the counsel of his commanders and carry out the plans he had already determined. In a fitting coda, when Reynolds was finally awakened from his slumber and told the results, he would bitterly complain to Darius Couch, "What was the point in calling us all together at this time of night when he planned to retreat anyway?" By May 9th, both the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia were back precisely where they had been 2 weeks before. Even Robert E. Lee regretted the result because he clearly saw absolutely nothing had changed except that there were 30,000 fewer soldiers staring at each other across the Rappahannock River. Historians now and then have theorized on what happened to the cocky, arrogant Fighting Joe Hooker. Some have suggested he was drunk. Others suggested it's because he was not drunk. Did he lose his nerve? Was the top spot in the Army hierarchy one promotion too many? Author James McPherson has suggested metaphorically that he was like the rabbit mesmerized by the old gray fox. Others point to the obvious concussion that he suffered on the porch of the Chancellor House when Porter Alexander's solid shot split the column on which Hooker was leaning and sent him flying into an unconscious heap. Perhaps, though, the most fair and balanced description was provided years later by Brigade Commander Regis de Trobriand in his own memoirs when he said Hooker was no longer Hooker. Now, interestingly, for a man that has had as much to say as Joe Hooker, his official report on the Battle of Chancellorsville is the very definition of brevity. It contains no narrative, no explanation, and is limited to less than a page and a half in the official records. Just 3 entries include a May 3rd telegram to the President announcing the battles of May 2nd and May 3rd, in which his army was unsuccessful. General Orders 47, dated April 30th, which we already mentioned, announcing the initial success of the flanking attack. And General Orders 49, issued on May 6th upon the Army's return to its Falmouth camp, which is what we would call spin. He would note that if it hasn't accomplished all it was expected, the reasons are well known to the Army. It's nice to know they were known to someone because nobody else seemed to know what they were. I'm not quite sure how you justify by saying in withdrawing before giving a general battle to our adversaries, the Army's given renewed evidence of confidence in itself, unless, of course, that confidence is to retreat. And by our celerity and secrecy of movement, our advance and passage through the rivers were undisputed, both directions, and on our withdrawal not a rebel ventured to follow. This is true. By contrast, George Meade's report consumes nearly 4.5 pages in the official records. It also includes a circular that Meade sent to his fellow corps commanders as a result of an escalating dispute between Hooker and him with respect to the Council of War vote. Hooker had publicly reported that Meade had supported the retreat after having been assured the men and artillery could be gotten safely back over the river. Meade coldly rejected the sophistry and looked to his fellow generals to support his side. Reynolds and Howard both did so, Sickles sided with Hooker, saying that indeed Meade had changed his mind. There are no records of responses from either Couch or Butterfield, so this dispute is going to surface once again as the Army moves toward Pennsylvania. Now, it is perhaps one thing to obfuscate with those who work for you. It's an entirely different thing when you decide to do it with your boss. However, as the Army of the Potomac is returning to its camps at Falmouth, Hooker will begin to, as they say in New Orleans, crawfish. On May 6th, he will telegraph President Lincoln. He sees no way of giving a general battle. I'm not certain what it is that he thought that he was doing. And he also suggests that no more than 3 corps were involved in the entire ball game, whereas virtually everyone had participated and had taken significant casualties. All 7 corps suffered battle casualties, most particularly the 3rd, 6th, 11th, and 12th. Hooker would continue his spin the next day. He's waiting to find out what his troops feel. They shouldn't be depressed. I'm not certain why. And we're also not certain exactly which corps it is that he wants to find at fault here that prevented him from having a glorious victory. If he decided in his own mind that a plan existed, he apparently never bothered to tell anyone what it was. I would note that in neither communication with the Commander-in-Chief does Fighting Joe even hint at any culpability on his part. Indeed, he's ready to go at it again and will soon be on the road to Gettysburg for the 3rd act in our drama. Now, while Hooker spins, whoops, we got more Hooker spin. This is probably the worst one. If it happens again, everything will be under my personal supervision because he did such a spectacular job supervising at Chancellorsville.
Question?
Sir.
Is this a concussion talking?
By this time, the effects of a concussion will go on in some cases for several weeks. This is probably 4 to 5 days after his concussion. He's back in his camps at Falmouth. He's beginning to act more like himself. He's beginning to have more of a grasp on what he wants to do, and this actually sounds like Hooker. It's everybody else's fault except mine.
Okay.
So. Now, while Hooker spins and contemplates a return to greatness, Robert E. Lee is not sitting idly by. Hooker passed the initiative to him back on April 30th at Chancellorsville, and Marse Robert is not of the mind to hand it back. His concerns, though, extend far beyond the blue troops across the Rappahannock, as more strategic issues are facing the Confederacy. Around Chattanooga, where Bragg's Army of Tennessee and Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland are dancing a minuet. And more significantly, farther west, around Vicksburg, where relentless Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Tennessee is in the process of bringing that key point, and with it the control of the Mississippi River, into Union hands. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet meet with Lee for several days in May, and consideration is given to sending portions of the Army in Northern Virginia out west to help drive Grant away from Vicksburg. Lee opposes this, and in the end is given permission to start a second invasion of the North. His objectives? To get the armies out of the war-worn areas of Virginia, to forage liberally in Union territory, by the way that has not witnessed the hard hand of war, as has Virginia, to damage northern railroads and industrial capabilities, and hopefully, to fight the Army of the Potomac to advantage and destroy it. Lee's first problem is reorganizing his army in the wake of Stonewall Jackson's death. Longstreet will still command the Confederate First Corps, and he will be Lee's second in command. Taking over Jackson's troops in the Second Corps will be Richard Stoddert Ewell, Old Baldy, who had been Jackson's trusted subordinate until he was wounded during the Second Manassas Campaign the previous August. Now healthy, sporting a new wooden leg, and, by the way, a new wife, Ewell is ready to go back to work. The new Third Corps commander will be Ambrose Powell Hill, who Lee describes as the best officer of his grade who was with me. Hill has quarreled with Longstreet. He's quarreled with Jackson in the past. Both had him placed under arrest. Now he will deal directly with Lee himself. Reorganized, flushed with victory at Chancellorsville, and with unbounded confidence in itself and its leader, the Army of Northern Virginia will begin its tramp back into the Union at the beginning of June 1863. Despite his post-Chancellorsville claims to Lincoln, Hooker has not embarked on any offensive plans, nor does he seem to even have one under consideration. It doesn't take long for the Federals to discover the Confederates are on the move, and that will get Hooker's wheels turning. His first thought, if Lee's moving north, I should move south. Makes sense. Descend on Richmond, capture it, and end the war. Abraham Lincoln, though, he's maturing as commander-in-chief. He realizes that not cities, but armies are the objective points. And always worried about the safety of his own capital, Lincoln wants Hooker to keep the inside track and stay between Lee and Washington, D.C. As the armies move north and as panic grows above the Mason-Dixon line, at the approach of the Vandal Southern horde, communications between Lincoln and Hooker and between Halleck and Hooker begin to become a bit more tense. At the center of the debate is the status of the 10,000-man garrison then at Harper's Ferry. Hooker wants them added to his army, while Lincoln and Halleck don't want to give up the post. On June 27th, Hooker chooses to up the ante by petulantly asking to be relieved if he cannot have the troops. Lincoln and Halleck call his bluff, and the second of our protagonists will now exit the stage. In the wee hours of June 28th, there's a knock at the pole of George Meade's tent. Colonel James Hardy of the War Department announces himself, telling Meade, "I've come to make trouble for you, General." Meade actually believes he's about to be placed under arrest. Recall the disagreement between himself and Hooker over the Council of War back at Chancellorsville. That situation hasn't resolved itself. Indeed, it's escalated, and the two generals are openly feuding. Meade believes this is Hooker's next move. Now, it's possible that Meade may have preferred arrest to what he got. Orders from the President naming him commanding general of the Army of the Potomac. There is no discussion, this is no offer, and there are no options on the table. Rather, this is a direct and unambiguous order. Meade has not campaigned for this position, and he's confided in a letter to his wife that he has no friends in high places to help him get it. But he's a career soldier, he understands his duty, and his duty is to follow orders. George Meade is 47 years old when his life takes this sudden turn. He would enter West Point back in 1831, graduate 4 years later, 19th ranking in a class of 56. His early career involved topographical engineering and an artillery assignment during the Seminole War. After not much more than a year in uniform, Meade would resign to pursue civil engineering work. After 6 years as a civilian, Meade decides that Army life is better, and he comes back and begins working on topographical surveys and construction of coastal lighthouses, interrupted for a time by service with Winfield Scott during the Mexican War. The start of the Civil War would see him as a brigadier general of volunteers. He would suffer wounds on the peninsula, lead a corps at Antietam after Hooker was wounded, and by Fredericksburg had risen to major general. He has a solid war record under his belt. Unlike many others, Meade has avoided Army politics and never campaigned for the position he now has. Meade and Hardy would make their way to Hooker's headquarters, where Hardy hands him the order relieving him and appointing Meade. Hooker, too, understands orders. He realizes his bluff has been called when he was holding a losing hand. Because he's conducted his march north under the same shroud of secrecy that he did his Chancellorsville campaign, Hooker knows Meade has no idea of the positions of the Army. So he graciously spends several hours bringing Meade up to speed, because everybody can tell a collision between the two forces is not far off. Fast forward 4 days. It's the 2nd of July. A nearly full moon has begun to rise over the smoke and carnage around the Leicester House on Cemetery Ridge. We have here another gathering of commanders, but this time the group is a little bit larger. Artillery and rifle fire has only just faded away a few hundred yards north of the Leicester House along the Baltimore Pike, but is distinctly heard in the woods to the east. George Meade stands at the head of a small table, illuminated by a single candle. A water bucket and ladle is the only refreshment available, so the assembled generals content themselves with cigars. 12 guys smoking cigars in a 10 by 12 room. You do the math. They talk amiably about what they've seen over the past 40 hours. Meade says nothing, reflecting quietly, half listening, half trying to get his arms around the situation, and at the same time recalling a message he had sent to Washington just an hour before. Now, the story of Gettysburg is familiar to even the most casual student. It was just yesterday morning, July 1st, when Confederates under Little Powell Hill had come marching down the Chambersburg Pike on their way to Gettysburg. The old story about the search for shoes was most likely nothing more than a romantic myth attached to what would become the largest military contest in North America. But nothing changes the fact that there will be a collision to the northwest of the town of 2,500 between Henry Heath's gray-clad infantry and the troopers of Federal General John Buford's cavalry division. What should have been an easy hour-long march from where the first shot was fired to the Diamond in Gettysburg will take Confederates more than 8 hours and will cost the armies more than 15,000 casualties. First Corps Commander John Reynolds, Meade's friend and ally at the Chancellorsville Council of War, is now dead, shot down while rushing troops to the support of Buford's hard-pressed and outnumbered cavalrymen. Meade's other Chancellorsville ally, Oliver Howard, has had another bad day with the 11th Corps. As they rushed to the fields north of town to extend Reynolds' line, they found no good defensive ground and were driven ingloriously back through Gettysburg by Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps veterans. But both Howard and Winfield Scott Hancock, now in his first battle as commander of the Union 2nd Corps, having replaced a disgusted Darius Couch, who refused to serve any longer under Joe Hooker, managed to rally the broken troops on good defensive ground south of town, securing Cemetery Hill, the upper reaches of Cemetery Ridge, and the wooded slopes of Culp's Hill to the east. Tactically defeated by their Confederate rivals on July 1st, the Army of the Potomac could find solace in a strategic victory by having saved and secured the high ground until the rest of the Army could come into position. Meade would recall that he had begun planning a defensive battle line along Big Pipe Creek south of the Pennsylvania border in the old line state of Maryland. But after receiving the first dispatches from John Reynolds and subsequent messages from Win Hancock, Meade would scrap those plans, take the advice of his on-scene commanders, both men he trusted implicitly, and concentrate his army at Gettysburg. Throughout the night, Slocum's 12th Corps, temporarily under Alpheus Williams, while Slocum served, at least in his own mind, as a wing commander, would begin to file into Culp's Hill and onto the lower extremities of Cemetery Ridge. Hancock's 2nd Corps would stretch south along the ridge from Cemetery Hill, and Dan Sickles would add his 2 divisions into the line. Still en route to the scene was the 5th Corps, now under George Sykes, since Meade's promotion to Army Command, and John Sedgwick's 6th Corps, making a 35-mile forced march from Manchester, Maryland, where they had been on the far right of what was the now abandoned Pipe Creek line. Before 1 a.m. on July 2nd, Meade himself would rein up outside the Leicester House on Baltimore Pike and on the south slope of Cemetery Hill and assume command in person. As he listens to his generals talk about their positions, their casualties, and how their men were situated for ammunition and supplies, Meade would recall the quiet morning of July 2nd while he reconnoitered his lines and awaited Morse Roberts' next move. Meade was concerned. The lack of activity on the Confederates' part was unusual. It's not likely to give up the initiative, especially after success on the first day. Meade had taken the time, though, to thoroughly inspect his defensive arrangements with his skilled engineer's eye. Across the valley, separating the 2 armies, Lee was having some problems that heretofore would have been quite unusual for the Army of Northern Virginia. Ewell's attack during the late afternoon of the 1st had stalled, and his troops had become disorganized within the streets of Gettysburg. Ewell and his commanders chose not to press the attack while the Federals were on the run. And the first intimation that Stonewall Jackson was no longer leading the 2nd Corps were becoming painfully obvious. At the same time, the once combative division commander A.P. Hill and his 3rd Corps could not be had turned into the less than ambitious Corps commander A.P. Hill and could not be stirred into further action. Hill had also taken sick, a sign of things to come throughout the rest of the war whenever Lee would need him most. Old Pete Longstreet was only just coming onto the field as the sun set on the first day of fighting, and Lee had determined to use his 1st Corps to carry the fighting on the next day. Since before the sun rose in the morning and up until the present day, the arguments continue about what Lee wanted Longstreet to do and when he was to do it. Longstreet's Chief of Staff, Moxley Sorrell, would say in his memoirs 30 years later of Longstreet, there was apathy in his movements. They lacked the fire and point of his usual bearing on the battlefield. Less friendly critics would say he sulked or even disobeyed orders. Regardless, it would take Longstreet most of the daylight hours to shift the divisions of John Bell Hood's and Lafayette McLaws to the south end of the field along Seminary and Warfield ridges, and he would not open his attack until nearly 4 p.m. Once Longstreet did attack, Meade spent the better part of his afternoon deftly using his interior lines to shift troops to threatened parts of the line. Dan Sickles, remembering what had happened to his 3rd Corps 2 months previous when it had left Hazel Grove at Chancellorsville, spied a piece of higher ground out front. Nearly everyone except Sickles realized the decision to move his troops out to the peach orchard and align them in a salient was both military folly and a disruption of Meade's defensive scheme. Meade and Hancock would anxiously rush troops from unthreatened portions of the line to support Sickles in the peach orchard, the wheat field, and Devil's Den. Chief Engineer Gouverneur Warren would discover the danger to Little Round Top, occupied by only a few signalmen, and appropriate remnants of Sykes' 5th Corps who reached the summit only minutes before Hood's Texans and Alabamans. In the end, the 3rd Corps would be shattered, but Meade's left line had held. Longstreet would later pronounce the efforts of his 2 divisions as the best 3 hours fighting ever done by troops anywhere. As his attack reached its zenith at the other end of the line, Dick Ewell would start to get his troops into action. Edward Johnson's division would try to take Culp's Hill, while Jubal Early assaulted the northeast slope of Cemetery Hill. Robert Rhodes' division got into line, but never moved out, and would retire in the darkness to their positions in town. It was the final sounds of Early's battle that could still be heard as Meade's commanders gathered, and Johnson was still trying to make some lodgments in Culp's Hill in some of the trenches abandoned by the 12th Corps earlier in the day, a few hours before, when they were sent to help repel Longstreet's attacks. Tactically, the day had been a draw. Meade had bent, but not broken. Lee has gained some ground, but it's not all that good. Most notably, he's gained the Peach Orchard and Devil's Den. Some of his troops even managed to reach the Union lines on Cemetery Ridge. Cemetery Hill, though, is firmly in Union hands. The Confederates on Cemetery Ridge were expelled, and the Confederates could not even claim a toehold over on Culp's Hill. Our discussion has gone on now for about 2 hours. Finally, Chief of Staff Dan Butterfield proposes 3 questions to the assembled generals, instantly changing what one modern-day writer has termed an executive session into a formal council of war. This had not been Meade's intent, but he acquiesces to Butterfield's initiative. Besides, it's time to move on. There's still a battle to fight, and Lee is showing no signs of leaving. Butterfield poses his first question. Under the existing circumstances, is it advisable for this army to remain in its present position or to retire to another nearer its base of supplies? The die is cast. As we had done at Chancellorsville 2 months before, we begin voting in inverse order of seniority. The junior commander is Brigadier General John Gibbon. He's temporarily leading the 2nd Corps, while Hancock is assuming an expanded role in the left end of the line. Gibbon votes to stay and fight it out, but in deference to early criticism of the Army's position, he adds that such corrections to the position as may be necessary should be made. Alpheus Williams agrees, as does David Bell Birney, who is now leading the 3rd Corps in place of the wounded Dan Sickles, and along with them, new 5th Corps Commander George Sykes. John Newton had been assigned to lead the 1st Corps following Reynolds' death. It was Newton who had suggested the position of the Army was bad and that Gettysburg was no place to fight a battle. That caused Gibbon to question him during the conference. But after all the discussion, Newton isn't ready to retreat either. Oliver Otis Howard must be sensing deja vu. His position on July 2nd is a near rerun of that on May 4th. His corps has not acquitted itself well and is largely responsible for the reverses on the previous day. Howard, it's recorded, has much to say, but no one is really paying him much attention, except to record his vote in favor of staying. Winfield Scott Hancock is the next to speak. He's been fighting the damage all day caused by the Third Corps on the left. He agrees that some positions need to be rectified, but he clearly opposes giving up the field. Two senior generals in the room. Slocum and Sedgwick have a common concern. They're largely without commands. Both men have had their troops spirited off to assist other commands, and Sedgwick has gone so far as to tell his own staff that he might as well go home. But neither he nor Slocum are leaving, and Slocum closes the vote by saying, "Stay and fight it out." The vote is unanimous. Butterfield now places a second question on the floor. It being determined to remain in the present position, shall the army attack or wait the attack of the enemy? Recent discussion on the condition of the army still in their minds, another unanimous decision is quickly reached. Finally, the last question, if we wait attack, how long do we wait? The consensus is to wait for 1 day. The army cannot remain idle. And with that, Meade closes the conference by telling them, such then is the decision. The hour nears midnight. The council is over. Interestingly, Meade had already arrived at his decision some 4 hours earlier when he sends this wire to General-in-Chief Henry Halleck in Washington, D.C. He basically reviews the terms of the battle throughout the day and the severity of the contest, as well as some of the damage to the general staff. But then he concludes, "I shall remain in my present position tomorrow, but am not prepared to say until better advised of the condition of the army, whether my operations will be of an offensive or defensive character." Now, following a frank and open review of the battle and discussion of military matters, Meade's lieutenants had reached the same conclusion as their boss. Note, this was sent an hour before the conference had begun in Meade's headquarters. Of course, we all know that July 3rd would witness what would come to be known as the high watermark of the Confederacy, when 12,000 troops comprising the tide of Longstreet's assault would crash upon the breakers of the Federal Cemetery Ridge position and then roll back across the valley in defeat. And we also know that defeat would prompt Robert E. Lee's veterans to head back south toward the safety of Virginia, with the sobering knowledge that 28,000 of their fellow soldiers would not be going along. There would be other fields. The war would continue for nearly 2 more years, and the Army in Northern Virginia would prove time and again it still had fight left in it, but never enough to engage in serious offensive actions. Both Hooker at Chancellorsville and Meade at Gettysburg had brought their commanders together with a plan of action already in mind. Hooker would seek to bend his generals to his will after having kept them out of the planning and, in some cases, out of the fight. As a result, he badly misjudged the temperament of the commanders. Meade never had the time to develop a continuing campaign strategy, and the suddenness of his ascension to command precluded very much discussion with his commanders at all. However, throughout the days leading up to the battle and during the fighting at Gettysburg, all the senior commanders were kept continually abreast of what was taking place and what they were expected to do. The openness of communications gave Meade a good insight into what his commanders were thinking and what they wanted to do, and he allowed them to develop their conclusion while he watched in silence. Hooker sought to deflect blame for his failures at Chancellorsville when his Council of War failed to give him the backing he sought. He pushed ahead regardless. He would subsequently seek to assign blame and would publicly insist his council, and most especially George Meade, had sustained his decision to retreat. Ironically, Meade would come to succeed Hooker, and when his own turn came to seek the counsel of his commanders, it was an exercise in solidarity. Hooker would lose his command and never again lead more than a corps. Although largely overshadowed in history by the coming of Grant, Meade would retain command of the Army of the Potomac for the rest of the war. The final protagonist in our tragic drama would be the last to lead the Army of the Potomac, Greek chorus, the Sword of Lincoln. And with that, I thank you.